On his 18th birthday, an orphan aged out of the system and inherited a single, worthless sea cave. What he discovered inside wasn't just about the past. It was about who he was meant to become. If you've ever felt like you were starting over with nothing, or that the world had already counted you out, then this story is for you. Stick around and maybe consider hitting that subscribe button, because we talk about things like this here, the stuff that really matters. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist as a problem for the state of California. There was no cake. There were no balloons. There was just a folding chair in a beige room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation, and a woman named Ms. Albright sitting across a metal desk from me. She had a kind of tired, institutional kindness that I'd learned to recognize over the years. It was a kindness that had limits, that operated within budgets and according to regulations. It wouldn't follow you out the door. She slid a thin file across the desk. My name was on it, Leo Vance, followed by a long series of numbers that had been my real name for the last decade. "Well, Leo," she said, her voice flat but not unkind, "you've aged out. As of 9:04 this morning, you are officially an adult." I didn't feel like an adult. I felt like a package that had reached its destination and was now sitting on a porch, unclaimed. I nodded, because that's what you did in these rooms. You nodded. You kept quiet. You made yourself small and easy to process. "You have your final stipend check," she continued, ticking off a list on her screen. "And the backpack with your personal effects." The backpack was a cheap black nylon thing sitting by my chair. It contained 2 changes of clothes, a worn paperback, and a toothbrush. The sum total of my life. "And then there's this," she said, pushing a thick, heavy manila envelope toward me. It looked ancient, the paper yellowed and soft at the edges. "This is an inheritance." The word hung in the air between us, absurd and out of place. Inheritance was for other people, people with families and histories and houses with attics. It wasn't for kids like me, who floated through the system like loose debris. I stared at the envelope. "From who?" "Your maternal grandfather, Silas Vance. The estate has been in probate, waiting for you to come of age. It's not, well, it's not much, I'm afraid." She looked at me with that professional pity I hated so much. The official filing describes it as a non-viable coastal parcel. It's a piece of cliffside property up north, near a town called Port Blossom. According to the surveyor's report, the parcel consists almost entirely of a sea cave, accessible only at low tide. A sea cave. I almost laughed. Of all the things a grandfather I barely remembered could leave me, he left me a hole in a rock. It felt less like a gift and more like the punchline to a long, cruel joke. My life. "The state has determined its assessed value to be negligible," Ms. Albright said, her voice softening slightly as if to cushion the blow. "There's a standing offer from a development corporation, Azure Horizons, to purchase the land for a nominal fee to absorb it into a larger parcel they're acquiring. $5,000. The paperwork is in there. Frankly, Leo, it's the only sensible option. Take the money." I picked up the envelope. It was heavy, weighted with the meaninglessness of it all. Silas Vance. The name was a ghost in my memory. I had a vague, faded image of a man with hands like worn leather and a face carved from driftwood, the smell of salt and engine oil clinging to him. He was the one who had dropped me at the gates of the first group home, a silent, grim-faced giant who turned and walked away without looking back. For 10 years I had cultivated my hatred for him, watered it, let it grow into the one solid thing I could hold on to. He had abandoned me. And now, as a final posthumous act of indifference, he had left me a wet rock. "Okay," I said, my voice raspy. I stood up, slinging the pathetic backpack over my shoulder. The weight of it, the lightness of it, was a familiar ache. "Thank you, Miss Albright." She nodded, her duty done. "Good luck, Leo." I didn't say anything back. Luck was another thing for other people. I walked out of the office, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me with a soft, pneumatic hiss, sealing off the only life I had ever known. I stood on the concrete steps, the gray city sprawling before me, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, terrifyingly, and utterly alone. The bus ride north was a long, rattling journey through landscapes I'd only ever seen in pictures. The concrete sprawl of the city slowly gave way to rolling brown hills, then to dense green forests shrouded in a persistent coastal fog. I sat with my forehead pressed against the cool, vibrating glass, the manila envelope resting on my lap like a tombstone. For the first few hours, I didn't even open it. The thought of it was exhausting. It was the final chapter of a story I already knew the ending to. I was not wanted. Not then, not now. But the boredom of the road, the endless repetition of trees and telephone poles, eventually wore me down. With a sigh, I broke the brittle wax seal. The contents slid out into my hand. It wasn't just the offer from Azure Horizons. There was a folded, creased topographical map, the kind serious hikers use. A small, jagged piece of coastline was circled in red ink, with a single black X marking a spot on the cliff face. There was a deed, a long and complicated document filled with legal jargon. But the name was clear. Silas Vance, transferring ownership to Leo Vance upon his 18th birthday. And at the bottom of the pile, there was a small, tarnished brass key. It was heavy, ornate, the kind you'd see in old movies. It felt ancient and important, a stark contrast to the flimsy, disposable world I came from. It had a small hole in the head, and someone had threaded a piece of worn leather through it. What was this key for? A worthless sea cave didn't need a key. I held it in my palm, its cold weight a small, solid mystery. The bus lurched, and the key slid against my skin. A memory, thin as smoke, flickered in my mind. A calloused thumb rubbing a small, carved bird. The scent of sawdust and the sea. I shook my head, pushing it away. Memories were traps. They promised warmth and delivered only the cold reality of what was lost. I focused on the letter from the law firm representing the estate. It was brief and to the point. Azure Horizons was consolidating land for a luxury resort development. My parcel was a geological inconvenience, a tiny notch in their otherwise pristine coastline. Their offer of $5,000 was described as generous and final. $5,000. To me, it was a fortune. It was a security deposit on a cheap apartment, first and last month's rent. It was a bus ticket to anywhere else. It was a buffer against the raw, terrifying edge of homelessness that I was now teetering on. Ms. Albright was right. It was the only sensible option. I could sign the papers, mail them from the next town, and never even have to look at the useless piece of rock my grandfather had left me. I could take the money and erase him and this place from my life for good. It was what he deserved. It was what I deserved. But as the bus wheezed and slowed, pulling into the foggy, salt-scoured town of Port Blossom, I looked down at the key in my hand. The sensible option felt hollow. It felt like a surrender. For 10 years, other people had made the sensible decisions for my life. They decided where I slept, what I ate, who I was. This was the first decision that was truly mine. And some stubborn, foolish part of me, a part I thought had been extinguished long ago, wanted to see it. I wanted to stand on that cliff and look at the final, insulting legacy of Silas Vance. I wanted to see the worthless thing he thought was a fitting inheritance for the grandson he'd thrown away. I folded the papers, tucked them back into the envelope, and clutched the key in my fist. When the bus doors hissed open, I was the only one who got off. Port Blossom was a town that seemed to be actively losing a battle with the sea. The buildings huddled together, their paint peeling from the constant assault of salty air. A low-hanging fog clung to everything, muffling sound and turning the world 100 shades of gray. The air smelled of low tide, diesel from the fishing boats in the small harbor, and the distant, comforting aroma of fried food. I felt the eyes of the town on me as I walked down the main street, my cheap backpack marking me as a transient, an outsider. A couple of old fishermen sitting on a bench outside the bait and tackle shop stopped their conversation to watch me pass, their faces as weathered and unreadable as the coastline itself. I saw a small diner called the Salty Spoon, its windows steamy and glowing with a warm yellow light. My stomach cramped with a hunger that was as much about loneliness as it was about food. I went inside. The place was small and warm, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of cutlery. I slid into a booth in the corner, feeling conspicuous. A waitress with a tired but friendly face came over, a coffee pot in her hand. "What can I get for you, hun?" she asked. "Just coffee, and maybe a menu." She poured the dark, steaming liquid into a thick ceramic mug. "Rough day to be traveling. Fog so thick you could carve it." "Just got into town," I said, my voice quiet. She gave me a quick, assessing look. "Passing through?" "Something like that." I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to tell her I was here to visit a hole in a rock. I ordered a plate of clam chowder and toast, and while I waited, I spread the topographical map out on the table. The red circle wasn't far, maybe a 2-mile walk south along the coastal trail. The trail itself was marked with a dotted line, suggesting it wasn't well maintained. The waitress returned with my food. "Hiking?" she asked, nodding at the map. "You'll want to be careful. That path can get slick. We lost a section of it in the last winter storm." "I'll be careful," I said. She refilled my coffee and left me alone. The chowder was hot and thick, and for a few minutes I felt almost normal, almost human, just a guy in a diner eating a meal. But the weight of the envelope in my jacket pocket was a constant reminder. What was I even doing here? This was a pointless pilgrimage, a detour fueled by a decade of anger. I should have stayed on the bus. I should have just signed the papers. I paid for my meal with a few crumpled bills from my stipend, leaving a small tip on the table. The waitress gave me a nod as I left. "Watch your step out there," she called after me. The fog seemed to have grown thicker, the world outside the diner's warm glow reduced to hazy shapes and shadows. I pulled up the collar of my thin jacket and started walking south, following the road as it curved along the edge of the harbor. The trail started where the pavement ended, a narrow dirt path that plunged into a grove of wind-swept cypress trees. The air grew colder, the sound of the town fading behind me, replaced by the rhythmic crash of unseen waves against the shore. The waitress was right. The path was treacherous, slick with mud and covered in a carpet of damp pine needles. In several places it had crumbled away, forcing me to scramble over rocks and cling to exposed roots. The sea was a constant, thunderous presence to my right, a churning gray void hidden by the fog. After what felt like an hour, the landscape began to match the contours on my map. The trees thinned, and I found myself on a high, exposed bluff. The wind was a physical force here, trying to push me back, to scour me from the cliff face. Below, through a break in the fog, I could see a small, crescent-shaped beach of black sand and smooth gray stones. And there, carved into the base of the cliff, was a dark vertical slash. The entrance to the cave. My inheritance. I found a steep, switchbacking trail, more of a goat path than anything, that led down to the beach. My sneakers slipped on the wet rock, and I had to half-slide the last few feet, landing hard on the stony shore. I stood up, brushing myself off, and faced the cave. It was larger than I'd expected, a gaping mouth in the rock, easily 20 feet high. The tide was out, exposing a wide shelf of rock littered with tide pools and slick green seaweed. The sound of my own breathing was lost in the roar of the surf echoing off the cliffs. This was it, the grand punchline. I took a deep breath, the cold, salty air burning my lungs, and walked toward the darkness. A part of me expected it to be just that, a shallow, damp cave, home to nothing but barnacles and crabs. A final, empty gesture from a man I barely knew. The air grew instantly colder as I stepped out of the wind and into the cave's entrance. The roar of the ocean became a deep, resonant boom that seemed to vibrate in my bones. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the gloom. The floor of the cave was uneven, sloping down towards the back, covered in pools of seawater left by the retreating tide. The walls were slick with moisture, glistening in the faint light that filtered in from the entrance. It smelled ancient, of salt and stone and decay. I pulled a small, cheap flashlight from my backpack, the one the state had issued me as part of my independent living kit. Its beam cut a weak, wavering circle through the darkness. I swept it across the walls. Nothing, just rock. I walked deeper, my footsteps echoing strangely. The cave was bigger than it looked from the outside, extending back at least 100 feet before narrowing into what looked like a dead end. I felt a surge of bitter disappointment that was surprisingly sharp. I had come all this way for this, to stand in a cold, wet, empty hole. All that anger, all that resentment, had led me to a place as empty as I felt. I kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering into a shallow pool. "Is this it?" I yelled, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the space and the sound of the sea. "This is what you leave me?" The only answer was the echo of my own angry voice. I was about to turn back, to walk away from this place and never think of it again, when my flashlight beam caught something. At the very back of the cave, almost hidden in the deepest shadows, the rock face wasn't natural. It was too smooth, too flat, and carved into it, leading upwards into the darkness, was a set of narrow, steep stone steps. My heart started to beat a little faster. This wasn't on any survey. This wasn't natural. I moved closer, my light tracing the edges of the worked stone. And then I saw it. To the right of the steps, set flush into the rock, was a heavy wooden door. It was made of thick, dark planks, swollen and warped by years of damp, but clearly man-made. It was bound with strips of rusted iron, and in its center was a small, tarnished brass lock. A lock that looked exactly like the one that would fit the key in my pocket. My hand trembled as I pulled the key out. It felt impossibly old, a relic from another time. I slid it into the lock. It resisted for a moment, the mechanism stiff with salt and disuse. But then, with a painful, grinding screech, the tumblers turned. I pulled on the heavy iron ring that served as a handle. The door groaned in protest, scraping against the stone floor, but it opened. The air that rushed out was different from the air in the cave. It was dry, musty, and still, like the air in a room that had been sealed for a very long time. I pointed my flashlight into the opening. It wasn't another cave. It was a room. A small, square room carved directly out of the solid rock. The walls were smooth, and there were wooden shelves built into them, also carved from the rock. There was a simple wooden cot against one wall, a neatly folded blanket on top of it. Against the far wall was a sturdy wooden desk and a chair. It was a secret place, a hidden world, a hermit's cell, a smuggler's den, a madman's retreat. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The floor was dusty but dry. Someone had lived here, or at the very least, spent a great deal of time here. The shelves were filled with books, their spines faded and cracked. There were jars filled with bolts and nails, coils of rope, and neatly stored fishing tackle. On the desk, everything was covered in a fine layer of gray dust, a silent testament to the years it had sat here, untouched. In the center of the desk sat two objects. One was a heavy, dark green metal footlocker, the kind soldiers use. It was locked with a heavy padlock. The other was a single, sealed envelope. It was made of the same thick, creamy paper as the deed, and on the front, written in a strong, spidery but familiar hand, was my name, Leo. I reached out and touched the envelope. My fingers left clean streaks in the dust. My breath caught in my throat. This was a message, a letter from the past, from a ghost. I carefully picked it up and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. I sat down in the dusty chair, my flashlight propped on the desk, and I began to read. My dear Leo, it began. If you are reading this, then it means two things. First, that you have turned 18 and you are a man now. And second, that I am gone. I hope you will find it in your heart to forgive an old man for the silence. I hope, when you know the truth, you will understand that every silent day was an act of love. My eyes burned. The words felt like a physical blow. I know what you must think of me, that I abandoned you, that I left you at that gate and never looked back. In a way, you are right. I did leave you, but I did it to save your life. The letter went on to explain. Silas hadn't been just a simple fisherman. He had a small charter business, but in a bad year, he'd taken a loan from the wrong people to fix his boat. They weren't bankers. They were predators who operated in the shadows of towns like Port Blossom, preying on people with nowhere else to turn. They slowly bled him dry, and when he couldn't pay, they forced him to use his boat for their own purposes. Smuggling, moving things up and down the coast that he didn't want to know about. He tried to get out, to go to the police, but they were too powerful, their network too deep. They threatened him. And then they threatened me, his only family, a little boy of 7. They told me they would make you disappear, Leo. They said it with a smile. I looked into their eyes, and I knew they meant it. I had two choices. I could keep you with me and watch every day, waiting for the moment they would take you from me. Or I could make you disappear first. I chose to hide you in the one place they would never think to look, in plain sight, in the state system. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, Walking away from you that day, it broke me in a way the sea never could. I had to stop reading, my vision blurring with tears. I squeezed my eyes shut, the image of his back, walking away, burning in my mind. It wasn't an act of abandonment. It was a sacrifice. I faked my death a year later, the letter continued. A boating accident during a storm. It was the only way to get them to stop looking, to truly set you free from my troubles. I've been living off the grid ever since, watching from a distance, getting reports when I could. Knowing you were safe was the only thing that kept me going. This cave, this room, was my workshop, my sanctuary. I carved it out of the rock with my own 2 hands over 20 years. It's the safest place I know. I looked around the small, perfect room, the smooth walls, the sturdy shelves. It wasn't a cave. It was a fortress. It was a testament to one man's determination and love. Everything I have in the world is in that footlocker, the letter concluded. Everything I managed to save, everything I hid from them. It is all yours. But I am an old sailor, and I believe in knots and puzzles. The key to the lock is hidden here, in this room. You'll have to find it. The only clue I will give you is this. Remember the storm petrel I carved for you? The one you used to sleep with every night. Find the bird, and you'll find the key. Be well, my boy. Know that you were never, not for one single second, unloved. Your grandfather, Silas. I let the letter fall from my fingers onto the dusty desk. The room was silent, save for the distant, muted roar of the ocean outside. The story of my life, the one I had built my entire identity on, had just been dismantled, stone by stone. I wasn't an abandoned child. I was a protected one. I wasn't unwanted. I was loved so fiercely that a man had erased himself from the world to keep me safe. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight in my chest. I doubled over, my head in my hands, and I wept. I cried for the 7-year-old boy left at the gate, confused and terrified. I cried for the angry teenager who nursed a bitter resentment in the cold rooms of institutions. I cried for the old man who had lived a life of lonely exile, all for me. And I cried for the years we had lost, the life we could have had, stolen from us by faceless, greedy men. When the tears finally subsided, I was left with a hollowed-out, aching emptiness. But underneath it, something else was stirring, a flicker of warmth, the truth. He loved me. After a long time, I wiped my face on my sleeve and stood up. I had to find the key. Remember the storm petrel. I closed my eyes, trying to force my way back through the fog of memory, back to being a small child. I remembered a bedroom that smelled of sea air. I remembered a rough wool blanket. And I remembered a small, smooth object in my hand. A bird. A wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. I opened my eyes and scanned the room, my flashlight beam dancing over the shelves, the cot, the walls. Nothing. It was just a simple, functional space. There were no decorations, no carvings, nothing that looked like a bird. I ran my hands over the rough-hewn surface of the desk. It was solid, heavy. The chair was the same. I felt a rising panic. What if I couldn't find it? What if the memory was too faded? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Think like him, an old sailor, a man who knew knots and puzzles. He wouldn't have made it impossible. He would have hidden it in a place that was both clever and meaningful. I knelt down and looked at the underside of the desk. Nothing. I examined the legs. They were thick, square posts of timber. I ran my hand down one of them, feeling the rough grain of the wood. And then my fingers brushed against it. It wasn't a separate object. It was part of the desk itself. Carved into the side of one of the front legs, low down near the floor, was a small, stylized carving of a bird in flight. A storm petrel. It was so subtle, so weathered, that it looked like a natural knot in the wood. My heart leaped. I pressed my thumb into the center of the carving. For a second, nothing happened. I pressed harder, and I felt a faint click. A tiny, rectangular section of the wood popped open, no bigger than a matchbox. It was a perfectly concealed compartment, and inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was another key. This one was smaller, more intricate than the one for the door. It was the key for the padlock on the footlocker. I took the key, my hand shaking, and stood up. The footlocker sat on the desk, a silent green sentinel. It held the truth of my grandfather's life and the beginning of my own. I slid the key into the padlock. It turned with a smooth, satisfying click. I lifted the heavy hasp and slowly, reverently, I raised the lid. The first thing I saw was money. Bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in paper bands. More money than I had ever seen in my life. It was stacked in neat rows, filling about half of the box. But underneath the money, there was something else. I lifted out the bundles of cash, my mind reeling at the amount. There must have been tens of thousands of dollars there. I set them carefully on the desk and looked back into the box. The rest of the space was filled with journals. A stack of at least a dozen leather-bound notebooks, their pages filled with the same strong, spidery script as the letter. There were also charts of the coastline, bundles of old photographs tied with string, and a thick file of legal documents. I opened the top journal. The first entry was dated the day after he left me at the home. "I have done the unthinkable," it read. "I have severed the last anchor that holds me to this world. Leo is safe now. I have to believe that. The cost is my own soul, but I pay it gladly." I flipped through the pages. It was a detailed account of his life in hiding, his struggles, his loneliness, his constant fear for me. But it was also a record of his fight. He had spent years secretly gathering information on the people who had ruined his life. Names, dates, transactions, shipping manifests. He had documented everything. It was all there, a meticulous case file built by a patient, determined man with nothing left to lose. Beneath the journals was one last envelope. This one was thicker, heavier. I opened it. Inside was another letter, and the documents from Silas's file. "Leo," the letter began, "now you have it all. The money is yours. It's clean. It's everything I was able to put away over a lifetime on the sea. It's enough for you to disappear. You can go anywhere, start a new life, be anyone you want to be. No one would ever blame you for taking the money and running. You deserve a life of peace, far away from the shadows of this town." I paused, the weight of his words settling on me. He was giving me an out, an escape, the very thing he never had. "But there is another choice," the letter went on. "The papers in this envelope are the evidence I collected. It's proof of what the men behind Azure Horizons have been doing to this coast for decades. They're not just developers. They are the same predators who came after me, just wearing more expensive suits. They've been buying up land by threatening people, running them out of business, poisoning their wells. The evidence is all there. It's enough to stop them, to bring them down. But it will be a fight. They are dangerous and powerful. If you choose this path, you will not be able to disappear. You will have to stand your ground. You will have to fight for this place." The letter ended with a final, heart-wrenching paragraph. "I never wanted this life of struggle for you, but I have come to believe that a man is not defined by the burdens he is given, but by the ones he chooses to carry. This land, this cave, this town, it is your birthright. It is your home, if you choose it to be. The choice, as all the most important choices are, is yours alone. Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of the man you have become. Your grandfather, Silas. I let the letter fall. The choice was laid out before me, as clear as the line between the sea and the sky. I could take the money and run. I could be anonymous, safe, and free. Or I could stay. I could take up my grandfather's fight. I could use his legacy not as an escape, but as a weapon. I looked at the bundles of cash on the desk. Then I looked at the journals, the evidence. One represented a future. The other represented a past and a purpose. For my entire life, I had been running. I had been moved from home to home, school to school, a piece of driftwood on an institutional tide. I never had a place to stand my ground, a place to call my own. I looked around the small, rock-hewn room. My grandfather had built this place with his bare hands. He had poured his love and his hope and his defiance into its very walls. It wasn't a worthless sea cave. It was a sanctuary. It was a legacy. It was home. And you don't run from home, you fight for it. I carefully placed the letter back in the envelope with the evidence. I put the journals back in the box. I left the money on the desk for now. I stood up and walked out of the small room, back into the main cave, leaving the wooden door ajar. The tide was beginning to turn, the sound of the waves growing louder, closer. I walked out of the cave's mouth and onto the stony beach. The fog had started to lift, and patches of blue sky were visible for the first time. The sun, low in the afternoon sky, broke through the clouds, casting a path of glittering gold across the water. I took a deep breath of the clean, salt-laced air. I was no longer Leo Vance, the orphan, the ward of the state. I was Leo Vance, the grandson of Silas Vance, and I had work to do. The walk back to Port Blossom felt different. The path was still treacherous, but I felt sure-footed, grounded. The town, when I reached it, no longer seemed gray and hostile. It looked like a place worth saving. I didn't know the first thing about fighting a powerful corporation, but my grandfather had given me the ammunition. I just needed to find someone who knew how to fire the gun. I went back to the Salty Spoon. The same waitress was there, wiping down the counter. She looked up as I came in. "You survived the trail, I see," she said with a small smile. "I did," I said, my voice sounding stronger than I expected. "I need some advice. I'm looking for a lawyer, a local one, someone who isn't afraid of a fight." She stopped wiping and looked at me, really looked at me this time. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent. She saw something had changed. "Most folks here use the firm over in the county seat," she said slowly. "But if you're looking for someone who isn't afraid of a fight, you want Arthur Pendleton. His office is just above the fish market. He's old and he's cantankerous, but he hates Azure Horizons more than he hates anything else." "Thank you," I said, my heart swelling with a gratitude so intense it almost hurt. "What's your name?" "I'm Sarah," she said. "And you're the Vance kid, aren't you? Silas's grandson." I was stunned. "How did you know?" She gave a wry smile. "This is a small town, hun. We all knew Silas, and we all knew he had a grandson he had to send away. People here don't forget." For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt seen. Arthur Pendleton's office was exactly as I'd pictured it. A dusty, cluttered room filled with towering stacks of books and papers, smelling of old paper and pipe tobacco. He was a man in his 70s, with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that were still sharp and piercing behind thick glasses. He listened to my story without interruption, his face impassive. When I finished, I pushed the envelope with Silas's evidence across his desk. He opened it and began to read, his eyes scanning the documents, the meticulous notes, the damning proof. He read for almost an hour in complete silence. Finally, he looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was a warrior's gleam. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He's built a case here that's ironclad. With this, we can do more than just stop them. We can bury them." And so the fight began. It wasn't a single dramatic courtroom battle. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Arthur filed injunctions. He leaked key pieces of evidence to a regional journalist he trusted. The story broke, first as a local piece, then it was picked up by a major newspaper. The State Attorney General's office launched an investigation into Azure Horizon's business practices. It turned out my grandfather wasn't their only victim. He was just the only one who had managed to build a fortress and fight back from beyond the grave. During those months, I used some of the money from the Foot Locker to rent a small room in town. But I spent most of my days at the cave. I cleaned the small room, aired it out, and made it my own. I bought a small generator for power and a propane stove. I bought a new blanket for the cot. I spent hours reading my grandfather's journals, getting to know the man I had only known as a ghost. I learned about his love for my grandmother, who had died when I was a baby. I learned about his passion for the sea, the names he had for every current and cove. I learned about his quiet, profound loneliness after he sent me away. I felt his presence in that room, in the smooth stone walls, in the rhythmic sound of the waves. One day, I took the rest of the money and I bought a boat. It wasn't much, just a small, sturdy, used fishing boat, the kind my grandfather would have had. I named it the Storm Petrel. I started taking it out on the water, teaching myself the coastline from his charts, learning the rhythms of the tide and the wind. The people of Port Blossom started to change, too. As the case against Azure Horizons grew stronger, the fear that had held the town in its grip for so long began to recede. People started talking. Other fishermen who had been pushed out, shop owners who had been threatened. They came forward with their own stories, adding their voices to the chorus my grandfather had started. They started to greet me on the street, to nod at me in the diner. Sarah would always have a hot cup of coffee ready for me. Arthur would argue with me about politics and fishing quotas. I wasn't Silas's ghost anymore. I was Leo, and I was home. The legal battle is still going, a slow-moving beast, but its conclusion is no longer in doubt. Azure Horizons is crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. The town is breathing again. And me? I'm still here. I live simply. I spend my days on the water and my evenings in the room my grandfather built, reading by the light of a single lamp. Sometimes I sit at the entrance to the cave and watch the sun set, painting the sky in colors of fire and gold. I think about inheritance. I used to think it was about money, about property, but I was wrong. My grandfather didn't leave me a worthless sea cave. He left me a story. He left me a choice. He left me a purpose. He taught me that home isn't a place you are given, but a place you build, a place you fight for. The greatest inheritance he gave me was the truth, that I was loved, that I was worth fighting for, and that I had the strength to continue that fight myself. It wasn't the discovery in the cave that saved me. It was the choice it gave me. The choice to stop running and to finally, for the first time in my life, stand my ground. And so, as I sit here, with the sound of the ocean as my constant companion, I wanted to share this with you. Maybe you have a story about a different kind of inheritance, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who you are. Maybe you've had to fight for your own sense of home. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments. I read every single one, because this community we're building here is based on the idea that our stories matter. They are the most valuable things we will ever own. If you believe that too, and you want to hear more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, please consider subscribing to the channel. It means the world to me. Thank you for listening, for being a part of this. And remember, sometimes the things that seem the most worthless are the things that hold the most value. You just have to be brave enough to look inside.